Welcome to Velvet Confessions, the place where the most unbelievable stories turn out to be true. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our family. And before we get into tonight's story, drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. We'd love to know you're out there. Now, settle in, because this one stays with you. She set her champagne flute down on the white cloth table, not hard, not with a dramatic clatter, just quietly, the way a person does when they've decided something. The way a person does when the decision has already been made and the only thing left is the execution. Her name was Helena Ashworth, and she had been the kind of woman people described as composed. Not cold. There's a difference, though very few people bother to learn it. Composed means you feel everything and choose, very deliberately, what you show. Cold means you feel nothing at all. Helena had always felt everything. Every slight, every betrayal, every quiet evening sitting across the dinner table from a man who had already, in every way that mattered, left. She simply hadn't let him know that she knew. Not yet. It's a piece around the neck of the woman, standing at the far end of the ballroom. The woman in the ivory column gown, laughing too loudly its husband had just whispered in her ear, was a brooch, not a necklace. A brooch, which might seem like an insignificant distinction until you understand what that brooch was. The Pemberton Thistle. A piece commissioned in 1924 by Helena's great-grandmother, Flora Pemberton, to commemorate her citizenship ceremony the day she became Canadian, a Scottish immigrant who had crossed an ocean with almost nothing and had saved for 6 years to have this piece made. Sterling silver, with a single amethyst at its center, shaped like the Scottish thistle. It had been passed to Flora's daughter, then to her daughter, then to Helena's mother, who had pressed it into Helena's hands on her wedding day and said, "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small, my love, and don't ever let this leave the family." The brooch had been in Helena's jewelry safe, a safe that her husband Dorian Ashworth had never known the combination to, or so she had believed, and yet, there it was, on the lapel of a 26-year-old woman who worked as a junior associate at Dorian's investment firm, who had been laughing at his jokes for the last 8 months, who was wearing Helena's great-grandmother's brooch, as though it were simply a pretty accessory she'd picked up at a boutique on Queen Street West. Helena picked up her champagne glass again, took a slow sip, and smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that means something is about to happen, and whoever stands in the way of it is going to remember the night they did. This was the Whitmore Foundation Gala, one of the most prominent charity events in Toronto's social calendar. Helena had been on the foundation's board for 11 years. She had helped plan this evening. She had selected the caterers, approved the centerpieces, sat through 4 steering committee meetings over 6 weeks. And Dorian, her husband of 17 years, the man who had smiled across this very room at her for the first 5 of those years before something in him had quietly shifted, had brought his girlfriend here, had brought her here to Helena's event, wearing Helena's heirloom, and had apparently decided this was acceptable. Helena had known about the affair for 3 months. She had not said a word, not because she was afraid, and not because she didn't know what to do. She had been quiet because silence is its own kind of strategy, and Helena Ashworth had always been a patient woman. Her lawyer's name was Francis Okafor, one of the sharpest family law practitioners in the city, with an office on Spey Street and a reputation that made opposing counsel visibly tense before depositions even began. Helena had first contacted Francis 11 weeks ago. They had met 4 times since then, each time in Francis's office, each time with the door closed and a full pot of coffee between them. Helena knew exactly where she stood. She knew what the division of assets would look like. She knew about the account Dorian had been siphoning. She had found the first discrepancy 14 months ago, buried in a quarterly statement she wasn't supposed to look too closely at, and she had said nothing, done nothing, simply begun keeping records. Every irregularity, every transfer, a quiet, meticulous ledger of the ways her husband had been stealing from their joint holdings for what Francis now believed was closer to 3 years. 3 years. A man can do a great deal of quiet damage in 3 years when he assumes his wife is too trusting to look. Helena had never been too trusting. She had simply been waiting. But the brooch, that was something she hadn't anticipated. That was the thing that had landed differently. She could absorb the betrayal of the affair. She could absorb the financial theft with something close to clinical detachment. Because money can be recovered. Accounts can be reconstructed. Lawyers can be very good at their jobs. What she had not been prepared for was the particular cruelty of watching her great-grandmother's thistle pinned to someone else's chest. That was the thing that had shifted something in Helena's chest tonight. Not into grief, not into fury, but into a very clear and very calm sense of now. She set her champagne glass down a second time. Then she crossed the room. The woman's name was Tatum Cole. Helena had looked her up 3 months ago. An ordinary about 12 minutes, and had told her most of what she needed to know. 26. From Guelph, originally. A degree from Western. She'd been at the firm for 2 years. In her Instagram photos, she smiled easily, had no idea group, or seemed to have no idea, that the man she was seeing was married, or perhaps she did know. Helena hadn't decided how much credit to extend. Dorian saw Helena coming first. She watched his face do the thing faces do when something has gone badly wrong, and there's no time to course correct. A flash of something that might have been panic, quickly smoothed over into an expression of careful neutrality. He was good at that. He had always been good at that. It was one of the things she had once admired about him, in a different life. Helena, he said. Dorian. She smiled. Then she looked at Tatum. I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Helena Ashworth, Dorian's wife. Tatum went very still. Whatever she had expected from this evening, it had clearly not been this. That's a beautiful brooch, Helena said. She watched Tatum's hand move involuntarily toward her lapel, hovering near it without touching. Thank you, she said. Her voice was careful. It was a gift. I know, Helena said. It was a gift from my husband. And before that, it was a gift from my mother. And before that, from her mother. She paused, just briefly. It was made for my great-grandmother, Flora Pemberton, in 1924. She was 22 years old when she became a Canadian citizen, and she saved for 6 years to commission it. She died in 1987 at the age of 85, and she wore it at every important occasion of her life. Helena tilted her head slightly. I have photographs if you'd like to see them. The color had drained from Tatum's face in a way that was quite thorough. She looked for a moment very young. I didn't know, Tatum said. And then before Helena could respond, I didn't know where it came from. He said it was from an estate sale. I would never have. I didn't know it was yours. Helena studied her for a moment. Tatum's hands were shaking slightly. Whatever she wasn't a good liar. And there was something in her eyes that looked less like guilt and more like a person slowly realizing the depth of a hole they hadn't known they were standing in. Helena believed her, not completely, but enough. She turned to Dorian. He had in the last 90 seconds made several small movements that she cataloged automatically. A half step back, a shift of weight to his left foot. His right hand had moved to his pocket, then, which meant he was thinking about his phone, which meant he was thinking about who to call. He had the look of a man calculating his options and finding them limited. We should go somewhere quieter, he said. Should we? Helena said pleasantly. I'm quite comfortable here. Helena, the brooch, Dorian. She kept her voice even, light almost, the way she might discuss a menu item or the weather. The one you gave Tatum, from my safe. The one you told me you didn't know the combination to. A muscle in his jaw moved. Once. He said nothing. I'm going to need it back tonight, she said, and then I think the three of us are going to have a very clear conversation about what happens next. Or, she looked at him steadily, you can wait and have that conversation with Francis Okafor, who I imagine will be somewhat less pleasant company than I am. She watched him absorb that. Watched the name land. Francis Okafor was not a name anyone in Toronto's financial circles heard without understanding what it meant. It meant Helena had not simply been sitting at home, trusting and oblivious. It meant that whatever Dorian had believed about how this would unfold, whatever version of events he had constructed in his head in which Helena discovered the affair and was devastated, in which he handled it gracefully, in which the transition from this marriage to the next chapter of his life was managed on his terms, none of that version was going to happen. How long? He asked quietly. 11 weeks since I contacted Francis, Helena said. 14 months since I found the first transfer. She paused. I've been keeping records. He looked in that moment like a man stepping on ice that he had been assured would hold, and feeling it give way. Tatum had taken the brooch from her lapel. She was holding it in both hands, looking down at it with an expression that had moved past shock into something that looked genuinely stricken. I'm so sorry, she said, and she held it out to Helena. Helena took it. She closed her fingers around the silver thistle, felt the familiar weight of it, the cool metal, the slight roughness of the amethyst in its setting, and she took one slow breath. Thank you, she said. She meant it, or at least some portion of it. She turned then and went to find Margaret Whitmore, the Foundation's chair, who was standing near the bar and was going to be very interested in a conversation Helena had been meaning to have with her about the next fiscal year's audit procedures. Margaret had been on the board longer than anyone. She had the kind of institutional memory that was invaluable, and the kind of discreet professionalism that meant she would absorb what Helena told her and not ripple it through the room before Helena had decided what she wanted rippled. The evening continued. Helena moved through it the way she always had, unhurried, attentive, greeting people by name, asking follow-up questions about things they had mentioned in passing months ago, remembering the details that made people feel seen. She had always been good at this. It had been one of the things Dorian had relied on in their 17 years, Helena's ability to hold a room, to make everyone in it feel as though they were in exactly the right place. She did not feel the brooch in her small evening bag as a weight. She felt it as something else. As ballast, maybe. The right kind of heaviness. Around 10:30 she stepped out onto the terrace. Toronto in November was not kind. There was a sharpness in the air that cut right through the warmth of the indoor event, and she could see the lake in the distance, black and silver under the lights of the city. She had lived in this city for 41 of her 47 years. She knew its sound and its rhythm, the way you know the breath of a place you've loved for a long time. She took out her phone and sent Francis a text. It's time. Francis's response came in under a minute. Ready when you are. The filing had been prepared for 2 weeks, sitting in Francis's office in a sealed folder. Property division. Documentation of the transfers. The evidence, organized and labeled, presented in the methodical, devastating way that Francis Okafor did everything. Dorian was going to spend the next several months in a very uncomfortable conversation with a number of legal professionals, and the outcome of that conversation was going to look very different from whatever he had imagined when he had pocketed his wife's jewelry and walked into this room tonight. Helena went back inside. She spotted Patricia Haverstock from the Globe Society pages near the dessert table, a woman whose weekly column was read by everyone who had been at events like this, and then read again by everyone who wished they had been. They had known each other for years. Patricia had the eyes of someone who noticed everything, and the discipline not to say most of it, until she decided exactly how she wanted it told. Lovely evening, Patricia said, when Helena approached. It has been, Helena agreed, though it's had its moments. Patricia looked at her with the particular attention of someone who understands subtext. Everything all right? Everything is exactly as it should be, Helena said. I'm actually thinking of the next gala. We've been talking about expanding the Foundation's youth arts programming. There's a story there that I think would be worth telling. Perhaps we could find time this week for coffee. I'd like that very much, Patricia said. They spoke for another 10 minutes. By the time Helena moved on, she could see Dorian standing near the coat check, his jacket over his arm, his phone pressed to his ear. He had the body language of a man who had been making calls for the last hour and was not finding the answers he wanted. Tatum was not in the room. Helena didn't know when she'd left and found she didn't particularly need to. She said her goodbyes. She thanked the event staff by name because she always did. She retrieved her own coat, and as she stepped into the car that was waiting for her car, the same driver she'd had for 9 years, a quiet man named Robert, who knew better than to ask how her evenings had gone on the nights. She came out with that particular set to her shoulders. She took the brooch from her bag and held it in her palm. The Pemberton thistle, silver and amethyst, commissioned by a woman who had crossed an ocean, who had believed that the things you made and kept and passed forward were the truest measure of a life. Helen about Flora. She thought about her mother. She thought about the jewelry safe in her bedroom, which she had changed the combination of the morning, after she'd first noticed the transfer discrepancy 14 months ago. She had not told Dorian, she had simply changed it, and she had wondered, ever since, how he had gotten to it the first time. She would find out. Francis would find out. There were ways of knowing things, if you were patient enough to look for them. The city moved past the car windows. The lights of downtown, the lake to the south, the neighborhood she'd watched change over 4 decades. She had built a life in this city, a real one, with weight and roots and the kind of complexity that only comes from having stayed somewhere long enough to know its character. She was not leaving it. She was not starting over. She was continuing. Without a man who had quietly decided she was a fixed point he could orbit, while moving further and further away, and she was going to be entirely fine. Better, actually. She thought that without any particular drama. It was simply a fact, the way the lake was a fact, the way November in Toronto was a fact. Something solid and real and already true, waiting for her to arrive at it. She closed her fingers around the brooch. Robert pulled onto her street. The house was lit from within. She'd left lights on, as she always did when she went out alone, because she had always liked coming home to a lit house, even before she'd understood why. The maple in the front yard had lost most of its leaves. By spring it would be extraordinary, again. She went inside. She went upstairs to her bedroom. She opened the jewelry safe, her combination, the one she'd changed 14 months ago, and she set the Pemberton thistle back in its velvet-lined place. It sat exactly as it always had, as it should. She closed the safe. She changed out of her gown and into something comfortable, and she made herself a cup of tea in her own kitchen, in her own house, in the city she had loved her whole life. The filing would go in tomorrow morning. Francis would handle what came next with the exactness and competence that had cost Helena a meaningful retainer and been worth every dollar of it. Dorian would discover in the days to come that a patient woman with good legal counsel and 14 months of careful documentation is not an adversary anyone should have been casual about. And the Whitmore Foundation Gala, which had already been a successful evening, was going to be remembered this year for 2 things. The remarkable turnout and the fact that Helena Ashworth had been, by the account of everyone who had been there, absolutely the most composed and striking person in the room. Not cold. There is, as she had always known, a difference. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do, humming and shifting and breathing. Through the long Canadian night, she had the brooch, she had Francis. She had her records, her house, her maple tree, her driver of 9 years, her seat on the foundation board, her knowledge of every quarterly statement for the last 3 years, and the particular kind of clarity that only comes to a person who has been patient long enough. She had, in other words, everything she needed. She drank her tea, and she thought about what spring was going to look like.